Welcome back to the deep dive. If you feel like the ground underneath international politics is shifting, well, you are absolutely right.
You're not imagining it.
No, not at all. We're taking that fire hose of global information, geopolitical analyses, security reports, financial transcripts, and we're trying to condense it down to the essential, fascinating insights you need to understand the new world we're living in.
And it is more than just tension. I mean, our sources, when you look at them collectively, they describe a violent structural transition. Today, we are looking at the foundational rules of global conduct being openly and very publicly rewritten.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive is to analyze four current global flashpoints that when you view them together, they really reveal the new playbook for power projection.
A new playbook, exactly.
We're calling this the quadruple threat. We have the unprecedented military action in Venezuela, the internal crisis facing NATO over Greenland, the highly disputed chaos in Iran, and then the overarching strategic context of the conflict in Ukraine.
And the common thread that links all of these seemingly disparate crises, is the open discarding of old international norms. We are witnessing the testing of new, very stark concepts like forcefully defined zones of influence and, ultimately the principle that the right of the strong prevails over law.
It feels like the world we grew up with, the one governed by decades of agreed-upon treaties and international frameworks, that's clearly being replaced. It's being replaced by a multipolar system where power and the willingness to use it are the ultimate arbiters. We are seeing aggressive postures in every direction, and it's signaling a dangerous new normal for sovereign nations everywhere, and that even includes some of America's closest allies.
It absolutely does.
Let's begin with the event that truly sent a shockwave through the whole concept of sovereign immunity. That would be the highly kinetic military action against Venezuela.
Right.
This was not a slow-motion sanction or some, diplomatic isolation campaign. This was a surgical, forceful, and frankly, shockingly immediate operation.
It was an act designed from the ground up to define a new precedent. U.S. Special Operations Force conducted airstrikes targeting key Venezuelan military communication and logistics bases. But crucially, they struck the presidential residence.
The residence itself, not just military targets.
No, the Miraflores Palace. The outcome was that President Nicolás Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores were physically captured. They were removed from Venezuelan soil and immediately flown to New York City.
And the charges waiting for him there, in Manhattan federal court, they reflect a very deliberate strategy, don't they?
Oh, completely. He's facing serious criminal charges, things like narco-terrorism and conspiracy. These aren't just political charges.
So they're framing him not as a head of state, but as a common criminal.
Precisely. The optics here are crucial. A sitting, recognized head of state, the face of a sovereign nation, is now being processed and scheduled for trial in a U.S. federal court, just like any highly dangerous criminal defendant. This is a profound escalation of statecraft.
So what was the official justification? How did the U.S. government even begin to explain this?
Well, the official U.S. rationale, and this was reiterated by President Trump himself, was very precise in its language. They said the U.S. was acting to counter drug traffickers and illegal migration.
A law enforcement action.
Exactly. They specifically denied they were waging a war against a sovereign state. They framed it purely as a law enforcement operation against a cartel leader who just happened to also be a president.
But that legal parsing, that was immediately dismissed by pretty much the rest of the world, right?
Oh, instantly. The international condemnation was swift and it was severe. Russia and China, along with, interestingly, regional players like Venezuela's neighbor, Colombia, they demanded an emergency UN Security Council meeting.
And what was the consensus there?
Unanimous, outside of the U.S. They condemned the action as nothing less than armed aggression. They called it a profound violation of the UN Charter and what they labeled an international crime committed against the very principle of state sovereignty.
That term, international crime, is very strong.
It's as strong as it gets in diplomatic language. And this brings us to a specific term used by Russian geopolitical analysts when describing the event, and it's a word we really need to unpack.
Bespredel.
Bespredel. Okay, what does that mean?
It isn't just lawlessness in the general sense. Bespredel carries a very specific Russian meaning. It signifies a total institutional failure, a situation where all agreed upon rules, boundaries, and legal frameworks have broken down completely.
So it's not just breaking the rules. It's the absence of any rules.
It's the absence of the game itself. It means a situation where the right of the strong simply prevails, and there is no appeal to any higher authority, legal or moral. It's pure power politics. So this is more than just a breach of international law. It's a declaration that the framework itself is obsolete, at least in the Western Hemisphere.
Exactly. The operation establishes a terrifying precedent for leaders everywhere. The message is, if you are defined as an enemy of the U.S., your sovereign status, your title as president or prime minister, it offers absolutely no protection against kinetic action and capture.
It signals that the U.S. is ready to make and enforce the new rules for its exclusive zone.
Unilaterally.
Now let's look at the aftermath inside Venezuela. I mean, the country must have been thrown into chaos.
Complete chaos. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez was immediately sworn in as acting president, and her initial demands were, predictably focused on the immediate, unconditional release of Maduro and his wife.
But the transition of power, I'm guessing, was less than seamless.
Far from it. Our sources suggest the success of the operation was highly dependent on betrayal and incompetence within Maduro's inner circle.
So an inside job.
It had to be. For Delta Force to pull off such a precise operation against a well-guarded leader, they needed high-level, real-time intelligence on his location, his security protocols, everything. This speculation was really amplified by the arrest of a key security minister shortly after the capture.
And there were some other details, right? Some exotic tech.
Yes, some reports even claimed the operation involved the use of non-lethal exotic technologies, things like directed sonic weapons to briefly neutralize or paralyze specific air defense systems long enough for the extraction helicopters to get in and out.
That paints a picture that is almost cinematic in its precision and daring. It's like something out of a movie.
It really is.
Meanwhile, what was the political reaction from the opposition? They must have been celebrating.
Celebrating is putting it mildly, though perhaps a bit prematurely. Opposition leader Maria Corina Machado praised the U.S. action. She even went so far as to suggest that President Trump deserved the Nobel Peace Prize for the strike.
A Nobel Prize.
Yet, even with that strong support from her, U.S. officials were very quick to clarify that Machado, while welcomed, lacked the necessary legal or political authority to simply assume power.
So the U.S. decapitated the regime, but didn't have a clear plan for what came next.
It seems that way. The operational goal was the regime change, but the implementation left behind a political vacuum. And that guarantees continued instability and contestation over legitimacy for months, if not years, to come.
And the geopolitical impact is profound. This action is viewed universally, everywhere outside the U.S., as the definitive, forceful return of the Monroe Doctrine.
No question, is reestablishing the Western Hemisphere from Tierra del Fuego all the way up to the Arctic as an exclusive U.S. security and economic zone.
But there's a paradox here, isn't there? A strategic paradox we need to spend some time on.
Yes, and it's a crucial one. While the U.S. achieved the tactical goal of capturing Maduro, this removal by a foreign military force could strategically turn him into a hero of all Latin America. Well, you are moving him from a struggling, domestically unpopular leader who oversaw a complete economic collapse into a martyr. A martyr for sovereignty against foreign aggression.
Right, he's no longer the guy responsible for hyperinflation. He's the guy who stood up to the gringos and got taken out.
Precisely. This could easily galvanize anti-U.S. sentiment across the entire region. It reinforces the historical memory of U.S. interventionism and makes future diplomatic relations infinitely harder. The U.S. won the short-term battle, but they may have unintentionally lost the long-term information war.
And we absolutely have to discuss the massive underlying economic motivation behind all this.
Oil.
It always comes back to oil. Venezuela holds the world's largest estimated oil reserve, something like 300 billion barrels. But there's a massive catch, isn't there? A catch that explains some of the post-capture market volatility.
There's a huge catch, and it's the composition of the oil itself. It's not the light, sweet crude that you find in Saudi Arabia, which is easy and cheap to refine. Venezuelan oil is notoriously heavy and highly viscous. It's closer to bitumen or asphalt.
So you can't just pump it out of the ground and put it in a tanker.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Extracting and refining this requires immense, specialized, and very expensive infrastructure. You need things known as upgraders and coker units, which are incredibly complex and capital-intensive. And Venezuelans have fallen into disrepair.
So the publicly stated U.S. aimed to become the primary global energy supplier by tapping into this massive reserve. It runs directly into the reality of infrastructure failure.
It slams into it like a brick wall, and the reality check from the energy sector was immediate and very sobering. The CEO of Exxon, Darren Woods, he expressed major skepticism about any large-scale investment.
Why? I mean, the political obstacle was gone.
Because the country has a decades-long history of asset confiscation and political risk. But the most telling data point, the one that really tells the story, was the financial market reaction. Chevron stock, despite the apparent victory that cleared the way for U.S. companies, actually fell following the news.
Okay, that's counterintuitive. Why did the market react negatively? That's the core insight here.
Because seizing the territory and detaining the leader doesn't automatically unlock the resources. Investors understand two things. First, the legal risk is extreme. Who really owns the oil now? And second, the upfront capital expenditure required is staggering.
You're talking about rebuilding an entire industry from scratch.
Basically, yes. Estimates suggest restoring Venezuelan oil capacity to previous levels requires a massive, complex investment in the range of $50 to $100 billion.
$100 billion.
Just to rebuild and modernize the infrastructure needed to handle that heavy crude. The market is signaling that the legal and operational risk associated with that massive outlay far, far outweighs the potential reward, especially when the transitional government's legitimacy is still so contested.
So that makes the short-term focus, which was mentioned in some reports, on Republican donors interested in heavy oil just for asphalt transport. It seems almost trivial compared to the stated geopolitical goal.
It is. It highlights the massive gap between the strategic ambition and the economic reality on the ground.
And what does the reaction or lack thereof from other world powers tell us?
It's maybe the most important takeaway. The lack of an immediate, robust military or economic retaliation from major players like Russia and China beyond the condemnation at the UNSC. It demonstrated a profound vulnerability.
So talk is cheap.
Very.
Yeah.
This operation validates the idea that if a country isn't ready and willing to defend its sovereign territory or its leaders, it is immediately vulnerable to this new right of the strong.
The operation against Maduro, then, demonstrates this new willingness of the U.S. to use highly kinetic, unconventional means to achieve regime change, openly disregarding international legal norms. And as we transition, this aggressive, unilateral posture immediately sends shockwaves north, challenging the integrity of America's own most crucial alliance.
The Venezuela shockwave was just the sharp opening act. It set the stage for a larger strategy that is now directly challenging the integrity of NATO. The focus shifts north to the Arctic, but the aggressive posture remains exactly the same.
Right. President Trump has renewed his insistence on acquiring Greenland. And the justification he's giving is that it's an urgent necessity for U.S. national security.
The claim is that Russia and China are allegedly expanding their military footprint nearby.
And is there any truth to that?
Well, it's vital to maintain context here. While that threat narrative is very strong in U.S. political circles, Danish and Norwegian defense officials have repeatedly refuted the claim. They say there's no significant recent military expansion by Russia or China near Greenland. The Financial Times looked into it and found no actionable evidence of a material change in presence.
So the narrative serves a purpose, whether it's true or not.
It serves a clear strategic purpose, justifying U.S. preemption.
And it was accompanied by rhetoric that, frankly, was just insulting to a long-standing NATO ally. The comment that Denmark's defense capability consists of just 2 dog sleds.
He was referring to the Sirius Sled Patrol. It's actually an elite Danish naval unit that patrols the vast Arctic coastline. It's an incredibly tough job.
But the comment itself is just belittling.
That kind of rhetoric speaks volumes, though. It frames Denmark not as an equal ally, but as a functionally dependent and incompetent vassal state. It implies they're incapable of protecting territory that the U.S. deems critical to its own security.
So from the U.S. perspective, Denmark's sovereign control over Greenland is an unacceptable vulnerability.
That's the bottom line.
But let's dive into why. Why is Greenland so strategically critical? This value stretches all the way back to the Cold War, doesn't it? It's all about geography and missile defense.
Greenland is the linchpin. It's as simple as that. The shortest flight path for intercontinental ballistic missiles traveling from Western Russia to the contiguous United States runs directly over the North Pole.
A polar route.
Exactly. This is why the existing Thule Air Base, which has been operating under a U.S.-Denmark defense pact since 1951, houses absolutely crucial early warning radar and missile tracking systems. Losing or even just weakening that control is seen as an existential threat to U.S. security.
And it's not just about missiles coming over the top, it's about what's underneath the water, too.
Greenland, along with Iceland and the UK, forms the geographic choke point known as the GIUK gap. We need to define this for the listener, because it's a core concept of Cold War strategy that is now having a major redux.
So what is the GIUK gap?
The GIUK gap is the primary maritime barrier between the North Atlantic and the Arctic Ocean. During the Cold War, it was the crucial line the West needed to hold to track and contain Soviet strategic submarines trying to break out into the Atlantic and threaten the U.S. eastern seaboard.
Oh, now.
In a renewed great power competition, controlling this gap, specifically through surveillance and monitoring from Greenland, is essential for tracking modern Russian and potentially, down the line, Chinese strategic submarines. It is a critical component of anti-submarine warfare.
So it's a geographic necessity for continental defense, not just some matter of political pride.
Absolutely. And that's before you even get to the other motivations.
Right. Beyond defense, there are significant resource motivations. You have vast untapped reserves of critical minerals, rare earth elements.
And the fact that climate change is opening up lucrative new Arctic shipping routes. The Northern Sea Route. Control of the island is control of the Arctic frontier.
And mirroring the Venezuela playbook, our sources say that analysts are discussing the military option as a viable, quick route to acquisition.
They are. Reports suggest a military takeover of the capital, Nuuk, could be executed with astonishing speed. Some say it could be done with as few as 5 helicopters in under 30 minutes.
How is that even possible?
You'd be capitalizing on the island's sparse population and minimal defensive structures. It's a logistical challenge, but not an insurmountable one for a force like the U.S. military.
So our sources are outlining a whole range of potential acquisition methods being considered by U.S. strategists. What are they?
There are a few. First, the most straightforward, an outright purchase, which of course Denmark has already flatly rejected.
They called the idea absurd.
They did. Second, something a bit more subtle, a free association treaty. This would be similar to the arrangements the U.S. has with Pacific nations like Palau or Micronesia. You offer massive financial support and investment in exchange for full U.S. defense control.
So buying control without buying the land.
Essentially. And third, you have the military option, or an aggressive political maneuver, like Trump's reported suggestion of offering $100,000 to every single Greenlander if they agree to join the U.S.
A direct buyout of the population.
It's a direct attempt to leverage wealth against sovereignty and to bypass the Danish government entirely.
This aggressive approach, directed at a NATO founder and ally, has created what you could call a catastrophic fault line within the alliance.
It has. The Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, issued a remarkably clear and devastating warning. She said that a U.S. military strike or a forceful annexation against Denmark over Greenland would functionally mean the end of NATO.
The end of NATO. That is not a phrase an ally uses lightly.
That is a profound statement. It signifies that the internal contradictions of the alliance have reached a breaking point. It fundamentally pits the new Trump Doctrine, which prioritizes the Western Hemisphere fortress, against the traditional NATO commitment to collective security, Article 5.
So by threatening Denmark, the U.S. is showing its hand.
It's saying the alliance structure is negotiable, but regional dominance is not.
Wait, I have a question here. If the U.S. is so focused on building its Western Hemisphere fortress, and they already have the critical Thule air base under the 1951 pact, why risk the total collapse of the entire alliance just for outright annexation? Doesn't the existing arrangement already give them the necessary military access they need?
That is the core strategic question, and it's a great one. The answer, I think, lies in the permanence and the exclusivity of control.
What do you mean?
The U.S. goal is not temporary access. It is absolute, unimpeachable sovereignty over this strategic area for the foreseeable future. A defense pact, an agreement, can be abrogated. It can be challenged by future Danish or Greenlandic governments who might have different ideas.
So ownership is forever.
Outright ownership, or a free association treaty that guarantees defense control in perpetuity, removes that contingency. It removes all future political risk. Furthermore, it sends an unmistakable message to Russia and China. The Arctic frontier is fully militarized and belongs exclusively to the U.S. sphere. The message is that the U.S. prioritizes its own continental defense interests over the collective security structure of NATO.
And the European allies, they're not just sitting back and watching this happen.
No, they're reacting defensively. The UK, France, and Germany, they're pushing back on the U.S. claims that Greenland is undefended. They're doing this by jointly proposing an Arctic Guard NATO mission.
So they're trying to call the U.S.'s bluff.
Exactly. They're trying to demonstrate to Washington that the island is, in fact, adequately defended by NATO nations, thus negating the U.S. security justification for annexation.
But the conflict runs deeper than just troop numbers, doesn't it?
Oh, much deeper. It is a clash of doctrines. And our sources say U.S. officials have signaled that if a choice must be made, the strategic importance of Greenland, the linchpin of the North American defense architecture, is prioritized over the survival of the traditional NATO framework.
That is a tectonic shift.
It is.
And the extrapolation here is highly concerning. The aggressive reestablishment of the Monroe Doctrine, seen through the detention of Maduro and now the threats against Denmark, suggests that the Western Hemisphere is being solidified as an impregnable U.S. fortress.
And some analysts are already looking north of the U.S. border.
Canada.
They're viewing Canada as the next logical target for acquisition, or let's say deeper integration, especially given the history of strategic resource cooperation and the vast, largely undefended border.
The commonality between the Venezuela situation and the Greenland threats is undeniable then. It's a willingness to use or threaten force against both adversaries and allies when national interests, defined now as raw strategic control, are perceived to be at stake.
International law and alliance solidarity are clearly secondary concerns. And this intentional generation of strategic volatility, this chaos, it perfectly transitions into how the U.S. and its rivals are dealing with the chaos unfolding in the East, specifically regarding Iran.
Right, let's pivot to the Middle East, where Iran is facing a severe internal crisis. It's characterized by widespread economic distress and massive protests. And it all started with money, or I guess the severe lack thereof.
That's right. The catalyst was purely economic. You had soaring inflation, a sharp devaluation of the currency, the rial, and the unbearable cost of essential goods like food and medicine.
So this economic suffering is really seen as years of pent-up discontent finally just boiling over. It's targeting the visible effects of state mismanagement, but also external coercion.
Absolutely. But the focus, however, it rapidly escalated from economic hardship to outright political demands. We saw calls for regime change and, very surprisingly, the rise of the exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi.
And he's become a real figurehead in this.
He's transformed from a sort of distant expatriate figure into a potential revolutionary leader. He's heading what some of our sources are calling the most significant threat to the Islamic Republic in years.
And the regime's response has been what you'd expect.
Brutal and total. They imposed a widespread internet blackout, which was reported to last over 60 hours, severely isolating the protests and preventing images from getting out.
And they used heavy force.
Very heavy force. The casualty figures are wildly disputed, which is always the case in these situations. Human rights organizations are reporting around 650 deaths, but other sources, particularly opposition groups, claim figures well over 2,000, with thousands more detained.
And we're hearing some disturbing accounts about how the regime is handling the dead.
Yes. Disturbing accounts of families being coerced into signing statements. Statements claiming their deceased loved ones were not part of the demonstrations, that they were just innocent passersby in order to be allowed to retrieve the bodies for burial.
That's a classic tactic.
It's a classic tactic used to suppress the official protest numbers and to intimidate the rest of the population.
This violence and the opaque nature of the conflict bring us to the core tension surrounding these events. Are they an organic, homegrown movement, or are they the result of what some sources are calling managed chaos?
And there are strong competing narratives here that really reveal the nature of modern geopolitical conflict.
So let's break down the first view, the external destabilization argument.
Right. Many sophisticated analyses argue that the protests are the deliberate, intended consequence of economic warfare. The sanctions regime, especially the threat of the 2025 snapback of UN sanctions, was explicitly designed to asphyxiate the civilian population.
Okay, we need to clarify what the snapback sanctions entail. That is a critical piece of jargon.
Absolutely. The snapback mechanism refers to the automatic reimposition of all previous UN sanctions that were waived under the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal.
So everything comes back at once.
Everything comes back. Immediately and comprehensively. It targets not just nuclear-related material, but whole sectors of the economy. Banking, shipping, oil exports, armaments. This mechanism essentially chokes Iran's ability to trade with any UN member state.
And the effect is intended to create civilian suffering so intense that it forces a revolt against the regime.
That's the theory. Sanctions in this context are viewed by many as a form of collective punishment that actually violates core UN human rights standards.
So the economic warfare approach is literally intended to incite revolt. But Iranian authorities and some external analysts, they counter this. They claim there's explicit, deliberate foreign interference fueling the most violent aspects of the chaos.
And the evidence they cite for this foreign interference is remarkably specific. It suggests a new era of hybrid warfare is upon us.
For instance,
we have reports claiming Mossad agents are actively operating within Iran. And not just operating, but openly posting messages in Farsi on social media, urging demonstrators to commit specific acts of civil disobedience and violence.
And the nature of the information warfare itself is changing rapidly, correct? We're not just talking about fake Twitter accounts anymore.
No, not at all. There are documented covert influence operations, reportedly sponsored by external intelligence agencies, that are using not just fake accounts, but increasingly sophisticated AI-generated content.
Deepfakes.
Deepfakes, highly realistic videos, all designed to promote the exiled Reza Pahlavi and the restoration of the monarchy. The goal is to lend an aura of historical legitimacy and inevitability to the destabilization effort.
And what about the destruction of civilian infrastructure? Things like hospitals, supermarkets, fire engines. That's also cited as key evidence supporting the managed chaos theory, right?
That's a crucial point, and it's one that analysts arguing for external destabilization really focus on.
Why?
They point out that genuine organic protests usually seek to preserve infrastructure that helps the population survive. The wholesale destruction of civilian life support systems. That only exacerbates the economic problems. It only hurts the average Iranian citizen.
And it serves the external goal of total state destabilization, not the welfare of the people.
Exactly. This kind of targeted destruction aligns perfectly with a foreign strategy aimed at total breakdown, not reform.
Meanwhile, the U.S. is applying massive political and military pressure from the outside.
Right. President Trump publicly urged protesters to keep protesting, and then he added the promise that help is on its way.
And that vague threat, help is on its way, it could cover a wide range of non-ground force intervention options.
Yes, and they're very carefully calibrated to avoid a repeat of the disastrous 1979 hostage crisis and its aftermath. The options being discussed include things like high-profile B-2 bomber strikes on key nuclear facilities,
Surgical Tomahawk missile strikes on specific IRGC barracks,
targeted severe cyber attacks against national infrastructure, and massive disinformation campaigns designed to confuse and demoralize the regime's security apparatus.
and there's another layer of economic coercion, too.
Yes. Trump also threatened a steep 25% tariff on countries, and he specifically named China, which is Iran's largest trade partner, that continue doing business with the Islamic Republic. This is aimed at further isolating Tehran and cutting off its last major economic lifeline.
How did China react to that?
The Chinese foreign minister's response was immediate and very defensive. He stated clearly that there are no winners in a tariff war and promised to safeguard their legitimate rights. This underscores the risk the U.S. is taking.
You're escalating a regional crisis into a global trade conflict.
But the strategic goal is unambiguous. Comprehensive economic suffocation combined with overt political destabilization to force a regime collapse.
The ultimate stakes of a regime collapse in Iran, though, are terrifying. This is not a small, homogenous nation we're talking about.
Absolutely not. Experts warn that if the Iranian regime were to fall into total disarray, the risk of a protracted civil war among the distinct ethnic groups, Kurds, Baluchis, Azerbaijanis, Persians, is extremely high.
And civil war in Iran wouldn't stay in Iran.
No. Iran's central location, its immense population, and its complex ethnic mosaic mean that such a civil war would be exponentially more destructive and regionally destabilizing than the wars in Iraq or Syria combined. The chaos would spill over into every neighboring state, and it could potentially ignite the entire West Asia region.
So the threat of intervention is thus balanced by the fear of unmanaged catastrophic chaos.
It is.
The willingness of external powers to risk such global instability in pursuit of regime change demonstrates just how high the stakes are in this new era of geopolitical competition. And this brings us back to the largest strategic conflict on the board, Ukraine, which is viewed as the ultimate testing ground for this new global order.
That's right. When we look at the conflict in Eastern Europe through the lens of Venezuela, Greenland, and Iran, we realize it is not merely a regional war. It is widely viewed by high-level analysts as the key testing ground for the transition to a new world order.
A decisive shift away from the post-Cold War liberal globalism that defined the last 30 years.
And crucially, the sources argue the ultimate goal of the current global conflict is less about territorial gains in Ukraine itself, and more about achieving a massive, pre-planned global financial restructuring. This is the establishment of a new currency world, often referred to as the Second Bretton Woods.
This is where we need to slow down, because the financial stakes, according to this analysis, are the true foundation of this new era. The goal is the creation of a sophisticated, two-tier digital and hybrid financial system.
And this transition is expected to finalize somewhere between 2026 and 2028.
Okay, break that down for me. What exactly does a two-tier digital hybrid financial system look like, and how on earth does this relate to the war in Ukraine?
In short, the two tiers involve separating trade and domestic finance. One tier, likely based on central bank digital currencies or CBDCs and enhanced surveillance, will govern domestic transactions and consumer debt management in Western states. This enables much greater state control over spending and credit.
And the second tier?
The other tier, the hybrid part, focuses on international trade. This is where systems like the IMF's special drawing rights, or potentially a basket of commodity-backed currencies, including those from BRICS nations, are intended to replace the absolute hegemony of the US dollar.
And to make that happen, you need to deal with the mountain of existing debt.
Exactly. This whole restructuring necessitates a massive, quiet write-off of existing global debt.
And this transition, which involves moving towards what you called a harsh digital future, where the state has vastly increased financial oversight, that requires a massive shift in Western societal acceptance.
It does. People don't give up financial freedom easily.
And this is where the conflict in Ukraine comes in, according to this view.
Precisely. To push through this immense, painful economic restructuring and debt write-off quietly, the political and financial elite need a universal catalyst. The image of an aggressive Russia, the bugbear, is deemed absolutely necessary.
So the war creates a crisis atmosphere.
It creates the requisite fear of God and societal mobilization. It distracts populations from the true nature of the financial overhaul occurring behind the scenes. People are far more concerned about national security and existential threats than they are about the technical details of digital currency implementation or massive debt write-downs.
That's a chilling interpretation of the conflict's broader purpose. So while this is happening, the U.S. is simultaneously reducing its global dominance footprint. It's focusing inward on securing its fortress in the Western Hemisphere.
Which connects directly back to the Monroe Doctrine we saw in Venezuela and Greenland.
It's all part of the same strategy.
There is also a fascinating paradox noted by some analysts in all this. The conflict, by demanding state mobilization for war resources, has unexpectedly slowed down the creeping process where large transnational corporations were subsuming traditional state power in the West. The necessity of mobilizing for war forced governments to assert control over supply chains and industrial output, at least temporarily reversing some of the trends of globalization. The state became more important again.
The larger trend, however, is the geopolitical realignment toward a world based on immense macro regions.
Correct. Likely dominated by the major civilizational zones: the American, the Chinese, and the Russian blocs.
And where does that leave Europe?
This realignment suggests the eventual functional decline or subordination of the European bloc. Europe is now facing extreme internal conflict. It's squeezed between the threat from Russia in the east and the deliberate strain being placed on its fundamental alliances by the U.S. in the Arctic. Its ability to act as an independent global power is diminishing rapidly.
Regarding the status of the special military operation, official Russian designation for the conflict, as of early 2026, the conflict is expected to continue for at least another half year. Why is the timeline still extended?
Primarily because Europe, despite the immense economic pain, is still not politically or strategically ready for capitulation or a final negotiated settlement.
And Russia's core demands, they remain firm.
Absolutely firm and non-negotiable. Demilitarization, denazification, and the formal recognition of the 4 newly joined regions, plus Crimea. These demands define the eastern boundary of Russia's intended macro-regional zone.
So Russia is now focusing not just on the territorial battle, but on writing the rules of the game for this emerging macro-regional world.
Yes, they are trying to establish the principles of sovereignty and spheres of influence that it believes will govern the future world order.
And this is where we connect all 4 flashpoints. It's where we demonstrate the unified playbook. The entire structure of global relations is being rewritten from scratch.
That's the key takeaway.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When we connect the explicit, forceful detention of a sovereign leader in Venezuela, the deliberate threats against a NATO ally like Denmark over Greenland, and the background necessity of the Ukraine conflict to enable these massive financial shifts, a singular, powerful pattern emerges.
Now what's the pattern?
The U.S. actions confirm that old international law is being deliberately superseded by the simple right of the strong and clearly defined, forcefully enforced spheres of influence.
This new volatile world demands that nations, particularly those seeking to define or defend their own sphere, develop not just the capacity but the political will to enforce those zones of influence.
And the reaction to the Venezuela crisis is a perfect example of this.
A perfect and alarming example. The fact that major players like Russia and China offered only purely rhetorical reactions rather than immediate, robust countermeasures demonstrated a fundamental vulnerability that aggressors will ruthlessly exploit.
The message being sent and received globally is brutally simple then.
It is. Strength and the willingness to utilize military and economic force unilaterally is the only currency that really matters now.
It means the old rulebook is officially in the recycling bin. Global relationships are now defined by immediate power and strategic utility.
We've witnessed the international system undergoing this violent structural transition, and it's driven by the U.S.'s rapid return to the Monroe Doctrine, the open use of force against sovereign leaders, defying the whole concept of sovereign immunity, the deliberate breakdown of alliances like NATO, and the necessity of a massive, quiet financial re-architecture happening in the background.
So what does this all mean for you, the person just trying to navigate this increasingly volatile world?
It means that the world's most powerful nation leveraged a localized war in Ukraine to create the global fear needed to enable massive financial shifts that will redefine your access to credit and the very nature of your currency.
It then leveraged the detention of a sovereign leader in Venezuela to reinforce its regional dominance, threatening the sovereignty of its closest allies like Denmark in the process.
So now that the boundaries of acceptable action have been so openly and dramatically redefined by the world's most powerful nation, we have to ask a final, provocative question.
And that is?
When the world superpower openly tears up the rulebook, how long before every other nation feels forced to do the same? This is the core question for the new multipolar world.